Hello, everyone. My name is David Goetz, and I'm giving a presentation today on the role of John Singleton Mosby in the Lincoln Conspiracy. It's based on my book titled Ever the Gray Ghost, Colonel John Singleton Mosby and the Lincoln Conspiracies. Before we get going this evening, I'd like to first begin by thanking Mike Movius and the CWRT Congress for sponsoring me. I am thrilled to death to have this opportunity to present this to you. I hope it is a good use of your time. I certainly worked for that. And I think what I need to tell you first of all is that this story is complex. And if you think that some of the things I'm telling you during this presentation are not connected, please know that they are connected. They're absolutely connected. And so just relax and enjoy the presentation, take in what I'm giving you. And I think by the end of the presentation, you'll see how everything fits together. My first slide here is of John Singleton Mosby. And this is a photograph of Mosby as a Confederate captain. You see the three stripes on his collar. Mosby wrote that this was his favorite photograph of himself. He just absolutely loved it. He loved the body language. He loved the uniform. Even though I don't know if he was a captain at the time he had the picture taken or not. But I'd like to start by giving a brief background of John Singleton Mosby, who he was and what he was about and this sort of thing before the war. He was born December 6, 1833, at the home of his maternal grandparents, the McLaurens, Reverend and Mrs. McLaurin, in Powhatan County, Virginia. His mother, Virginia, had already lost one child and was very concerned that she might lose this one. She and her husband lived on a farm out in the middle of nowhere in Nelson County, Virginia. And so she was miles and miles and miles away from any help should she need help during a delivery. So her mother, Mrs. McLaurin, invited her to spend a few weeks with her and Reverend McLaurin in Powhatan. And so she went out. Now, Mrs. Mosby had a difficult pregnancy. She had something called milk leg. That's a term I hadn't heard before. Milk leg is where a pregnant woman's legs become swollen, partly as a result of the pregnancy and some of the things that are going on. In those days, in the 1830s, the doctors at the time believed that the best way to treat that was to give some hideous combination of tobacco juice and some other concoctions and make the woman drink it, forcing her to vomit. And which she did and became weaker and weaker by the day. She was confined to bed for much of her pregnancy. But on December 6, 1833, she had a fine, healthy, loud baby, little Johnny, little Jack as she called him. Johnny was frail. He was thin. He was kind of pathetic looking. As a child, he had rounded shoulders. You can see in the photograph of Mosby here. He had rounded shoulders. He was confined to bed much of his early life. He didn't start to read until he was around 7. That was about the time that he first went to school. Now, the Mosbys had slaves. They had a family of slaves, a father, mother, and a son and a daughter. The son's name was Aaron Burton, B-U-R-T-O-N, Aaron Burton. And Mrs. Mosby sent young Johnny to school in what they called the neighborhood, probably about 2 miles away, where there was a school, a one-room schoolhouse. And Aaron's job was to look after young Johnny, which he did. So on the very first day of school, Johnny and Aaron, who, by the way, were best friends, which was very common back in years before the war, for the sons of slaves and the sons of slave owners to become best friends. They were really good friends. Aaron was probably closer to 14 or 15 when Johnny was about 7, something like that. And the boys at school saw these two coming up, and they thought to themselves, well, let's find out what this kid's made of. So they took Aaron and put him on a stump and auctioned him off to the highest bidder. Of course, it was all a big joke. But it wasn't a joke to John, and it surely wasn't a joke to Aaron. The story is that they were both crying, and the older kids were laughing at him. Ha ha ha, oh, look what you did, ha ha ha. And you can bet that this led to a fight between Johnny Mosby and some older kids. And this happened just about every day, where Johnny would come home from school. He would have bruises and, you know, a torn shirt or torn pants or something like that. And his mother would patch him up, tell him he was a good boy, fix his clothes, send him back out the next day, and he'd come home the next day with the same story. This went on for a long time, and eventually Johnny found, you know, a fistful of dust or a brick or something to keep these big kids off of him. He eventually started fighting for himself. He, let me fast forward to the time that he enters the University of Virginia. He was 16 in 1850 when he entered Mr. Jefferson's University at Charlottesville. Now, at that time, you didn't study for a 4-year degree. You studied for a 2-year certificate, and you were assigned specific professors to study the subjects that you wanted to study. John Mosby studied Latin, Greek, and the classics. He also studied math and some science. He was much better at Latin, Greek, and the classics than he was in science, as his grades showed. But yet, after 2 years, he finished his certificate program, absolutely adored his professors, and decided to stay on for another year to pursue his program. So now we're into the spring of 1853. Everybody's feeling a little frisky, as we all do in the spring of a school year. And John Mosby wanted to have a party at his parents' home, by now who were living within sight of Monticello outside of Charlottesville. It just so happened that there was another kid at the school who wanted to have a party at his place. And that young man invited the same pair of fiddlers that Mosby invited to his party for the same night. When the fiddlers told the young man, his name was George Turpin, when the fiddlers told Turpin that they had already committed to Mosby and it was just too late, they were only going to play for Mosby, he said, well, we'll see about that. He sends an intermediary with a message to Mosby from Turpin that the next time I see you, I will eat you blood raw. Mosby thought to himself, oh, we'll see about that. So Mosby goes to Turpin's boarding house in Charlottesville, waits for him to come out from the noon meal. And as Turpin comes out and he rounds the corner toward his room, here's John Mosby sitting on the steps with some other friend. I understand you want to say something to me, George. Yeah, those kids are mine. They're going to play for me on Saturday night. Mosby said, no, they're not. I got them first, fair and square. You're mine. Back and forth and back and forth. And finally, Turpin lunges at Mosby, who just by chance borrowed a pepperbox pistol before he went over there. A pepperbox pistol is about this big. It's has a fat barrel, shoots 5 or 6 balls. It is not a revolver, but when you pull the trigger, everything goes off at the same time. And the effective range of a pepperbox pistol was about 15 feet. It was a murderous weapon at close range, but after 15 feet, the balls all just seemed to go in different directions. So it wasn't a very effective weapon outside of the 5 yards. Anyway, he pulls his pistol out and shoots George Turpin point blank. One of the balls hits Turpin in the jaw and knocks out a couple of teeth. Another one barely misses his carotid artery. And so Turpin, falls to the floor. He's screaming in pain. And the other kids from the dining hall run out and they see John Mosby standing over George Turpin with a smoking pistol in his hand. Of course, Mosby's arrested. He's given a trial and is convicted of a misdemeanor, something like unlawful shooting, something along that line. And he was given a sentence of a year in the Albemarle County Jail and a $500 fine by the court. This is in probably around May of 1853. Mosby is then in jail. He is confined. He's miserable. It's boring. He's just nasty in there. It's damp. He sees the prosecuting attorney, a man named William Robertson, who was the DA in that county, talking to the jailer. And he asked Mr. Robertson if he could borrow some law books to pass the time. And Robertson said, yeah, sure, I'll send you some over. And so Robertson sends some law books to the jail for Mosby to read and pass the time. And so instead of just passing the time, John Mosby falls in love with law. He can't get enough of it. Well, sure enough, he gets sick again in the fall of that year, some lung issue, which is always the place that he gets sick. 3 doctors are brought in and advise the court that if this young man is expected to finish his term of incarceration, he might not live through it. So the court lets Mosby out just before Christmas of 1853. After he heals from the lung issue, Mosby goes back to Mr. Robertson and says, I want to become an attorney. Will you please mentor me? And what I didn't tell you is that because Mosby was put on trial for this experience of shooting George Turpin, he was thrown out of the University of Virginia. And the people who made that happen were his professors, who he adored. And this was the greatest wounding in Mosby's life, bar none, even though he was shot 3 or 4 times. So John Mosby is mentored by William Robertson to read law. Didn't go to law school, but he passed the bar on his first attempt. And so now at age 22, young Mosby is a lawyer. He goes to a little town called Howardsville, which is outside of Charlottesville. He's young, he's inexperienced, he's lonely, he's miserable. He doesn't have a lot of business, and he's just really frustrated. And he is at a friend's office one day, and a pretty young thing walks in. Her name is Pauline Clark, C-L-A-R-K-E. Pauline Clark from Kentucky. Pauline's father happens to be a former congressman who is now an ambassador to Guatemala and Central American countries. So Pauline comes from what you would call good stock. She is a Catholic. Mosby is not a Catholic. He was probably Presbyterian. He may have been baptized, but he never really practiced his faith. And these two fall in love. They are smitten with one another. And if you know about the religious practices of the day, of course, Catholics knew that the Protestants had horns under those hats, and the Protestants knew that the Catholics had tails under those dresses, and never the twain shall meet. But these two would not have it. They would only be interested in love and marriage. And Pauline was John Mosby's intellectual equal, maybe even superior in some ways. And they were just a wonderful couple. Got married in 1856 in Nashville, Tennessee, by a Catholic priest at probably the Maxwell House in Nashville. It is also likely, not absolutely confirmed, but it's quite likely that Andrew Johnson, then a newly minted senator from Tennessee, was at their wedding. You'll remember that if Pauline's father had been a congressman, and congressional protocol would indicate that if your daughter is being married in another person's district, you wouldn't want to invite that person to your daughter's wedding. So it's quite likely, that's where I could get this. It's quite likely, even though it's not written down anywhere that we can find, quite likely that Andrew Johnson, the future president of the United States, was at their wedding. So they move to Bristol, Virginia, which is on the border with Bristol, Tennessee, in Southwest Virginia. It is now 58. Their first child is born in March of 1858. John is practicing law in Bristol. It's a sort of a rough and ready town. A couple of railroad systems are coming together in Bristol. It's sort of like the Wild West, a lot of bar fights over women and money and that sort of thing. So they There's plenty of work for John Mosby to do. He becomes fairly stable as a lawyer. Now, as you know, in 1858, 1859, the longer things went on, there was more of a tension between the North and the South, and especially in those communities in the Upper South, militia units were being formed to protect the homeland. I think it had more to do with protecting themselves against the slavery rebellion, but that's just me. At any rate, one guy says, "Come on, Mosby, let's join the cavalry." So Mosby agrees and goes to a meeting of the Washington Mounted Rifles, headed up by a former West Point cadet, Grumble Jones, William E. Grumble Jones. Grumble Jones got his name the old-fashioned way. He barks and yells and is mean as a snake to his men. He's a very disciplined guy, but he comes to drill in denims and flannel shirts and that sort of thing. He's not very formal in that regard. Now, Mosby is not a soldier in the true sense of the word. He cannot stand column left and column right. He cannot stand guard duty. He cannot stand anything about the military lifestyle. But he gets to know Captain Jones, and Jones regales Mosby most evenings in his tent with stories about what it's like to be a soldier, what it's like to be a cavalryman. And Mosby is drawn to this man and stays in the unit. When war comes in 1861, the Washington Mounted Rifles are marched to Richmond, where they become a company in the 1st Virginia Cavalry, Jeb Stewart commanding. Mosby's parents meet him in Richmond and bring Aaron Burton with them. So Aaron Burton becomes Mosby's manservant and stays with John throughout the war, even though he has many opportunities to leave. He's very faithful to John. Let me go back. That's a picture of Mosby at about age 19. And this is Mosby as a major in the Confederate Army. And of course, there are lots of things going on in 1862, 1861, 62, 1863. Well, the end of 1862, Mosby has become a scout for Jeb Stewart. And as the armies are going into winter quarters, at late December of 1862, Mosby approaches Jeb Stewart, asks for a few men so he can stay back and monitor the federal cavalry units that are in Northern Virginia. Again, right out of Mosby's playbook, he just despises army life, regular army life. He wants to be out where the action is. Stewart gives him 9 men. After 2 weeks, Mosby comes back with all manner of captured soldiers, equipment, horses, tack, all that stuff, weapons, and no losses. So Stewart gives him 9 more. I'm sorry, a total of 15. The first 15. And so by June of 1863, Mosby has enough men to form what becomes known as the 43rd Battalion, Virginia Cavalry. So let me jump over to 1864. There have been a number of attempts to capture or kill Jeff Davis. There have also been a number of attempts, however weak, but attempts to capture or kill Abraham Lincoln. I think the first attempt to kill Lincoln that really got my attention was in 1861 as Lincoln was going to his first inaugural. A group known as the Knights of the Golden Circle had a castle in Baltimore, and they plotted to kill Abraham Lincoln before he got to Washington. Of course, he was taking a train, and the train company knew that this group was bad news and they were going to do some harm. And they had a guy named Alan Pinkerton, who was their railroad detective. And Alan Pinkerton found out through lots of ways that there was a plot to assassinate Lincoln before he got to Washington, and he helped keep that from happening. But here we are in 1864, and this is in late February 1864. where there is an attempt by Judson Kilpatrick, and you'll see the little arrow that points down to the lower right that says Kilpatrick, and then a guy named Dahlgren, Ulrich Dahlgren, a Union colonel. About in the middle of the screen is an arrow that points that says Dahlgren, and you can look up above that and you can see where the two of them started out together, about 4,500 men. Their mission was to get to Richmond and free Confederate POWs at Belle Isle, Libby Prison, and other POW camps in the city. And if they got the chance, to capture or kill Jefferson Davis. Somewhere along the line, and it's at night, Dahlgren, with 900 men, his mission was to go into Richmond, but he gets separated and they lose their way, and they end up, you can follow the little dotted line where that was where Dahlgren was supposed to go. But the line, the lateral line, the left to right line pointing to Dahlgren is where they ended up going. Let me go back one slide. That's Ulrich Dahlgren as a captain. Just a little bit of information about who he was. He was the son of Admiral Dahlgren, Dahlgren cannons, Dahlgren guns. And this young man lost a leg at Gettysburg, but he still wanted to be in the fight. And he had met President Lincoln. Lincoln really liked the guy. And so when the time came for this raid on Richmond, excuse me, President Lincoln wanted Ulrich Dahlgren, excuse me, now a colonel, to be involved in the raid. So here they are, and Dahlgren and his men get separated. There's even a smaller group of 90 men who get separated from the main body. They're all like running around in the dark, and they don't know where they're going, and they're being led over streams and rivers and whatnot by people who don't know what they're doing, and they get really kind of out of place. They are tracked by a Confederate militia unit who finds a way to get ahead of them and knows about where they're going to come out and waits for them. And then you have this. Dahlgren is shot in an ambush. He's killed. As he's lying on the ground, his body is now dead and cold. A 13-year-old boy is going through his clothing to see if he can find a watch or something of value. And he finds a set of orders, turns them over to his commanding officer, and they reveal, his orders reveal that he was to liberate these prisons and also to kill or capture President Davis and his cabinet if the opportunity presented. That set of documents ends up with Jefferson Davis, and they make 50 copies. It was just outraged that up until this point, neither side was making any attempts to kill or capture the other's president. And now you have in writing orders to kill or capture Jefferson Davis and the cabinet. So 50 copies are made. They're published in newspapers throughout the South. Southern people are just incensed and outraged. And I believe that this is the moment, this is the trigger that sets in motion the plans to get Abraham Lincoln. Now, there were plans, but they weren't as directed as these plans were. And if you look at the Confederate treasury records, and you can see that from April of 1861 to March of 1864, there's maybe $1 million spent for underground activities. From March of 64 until April of 65, there's like $2.5 million that's put toward setting up this attempt to get President Lincoln. So what do? Some of that money, and they're building on stuff that they've already done, but some of that money goes to creating something called the Secret Line, which is a series of 3 routes. You can see them here on the map. 3 sets of dotted lines that go from Richmond across the Rappahannock, and 3 lines that go up to Washington. They join together and go up to Washington. Why do we have these 3 lines? Well, these are the the primary routes where money and gold and VIPs and medicine and high-level communications would travel from Richmond to Washington. That line was ultimately expanded up into Canada, to Montreal, Canada, Ontario, Canada, through Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York. So you have this thing called the secret line. It was staffed by people who were Southern loyalists. Virtually all of them were volunteers. They owned homes or taverns or stables where people could switch out horses rapidly. They also used something called compartmentalization, so that you only knew your part of whatever was going on. So if there was medicine to be moved, or if there was money to be moved, or information to be moved, or people to be moved, you only knew your part of it. So you knew that whatever was happening would be left in a tree or in a stable or something like that. And your job was to get it from that point to the next point. And you didn't know who got that information or that person to where you are, nor did you know what the person next, the next person down was going to do. You didn't know who they were. So that if you got captured, you knew nothing. All you knew was your part. It was just, it was genius. And it worked. The Federals never quite got into it. People were so sure and adamant about what they were doing was the right thing. And of course, in Maryland, most of them hated the North, just hated them, especially for freeing the slaves and all that. So, and also for rid of habeas corpus and just lots of other things that the Lincoln administration was doing in the U.S. government. So it was a protected line. Along these lines is what I'm showing you here is the Sarat House. If you go to Clinton, Maryland today, that building is there. It's still there. That's that was Mary Sarat's house. John Sarat Jr. was there. Her husband died in 1862. John Sarat Sr. died. But that was a Confederate way station. And the likes of John Sarat, John Wilkes Booth, Stringfellow, all these guys, all these spies, wasn't just the spies. They were blockade runners. They were couriers from Richmond and so on and so forth. And that was one of their way stations. John Sarat ended up as the postal service clerk there. So they would, a lot of mail that would be dropped off there heading north would be repackaged by John Sarat, or maybe prepared for John Sarat, and he would send it through the federal mail system, go to Philadelphia, wherever, thanks to the U.S. government. And they were just using this over and over and over again. So the Sarat House, which is today the headquarters, not that building, but a building next to it, the headquarters of the Sarat Society. And I encourage you to get in touch with the Sarat Society because it's a great organization. And they have a fabulous research library that I've used I spent many, many hours in that place. Now there was this fellow is Thomas Nelson Conrad. Thomas Nelson Conrad was a captain in the Confederate Army. He was a spy. And Conrad was personally tasked by Jefferson Davis to monitor the movements of Abraham Lincoln for the purpose of finding the right place and the right time to capture Lincoln and bring him south. Why? He wanted to use Lincoln as a trade bait and also to sue for peace. Trade bait for Confederate POWs, get them out of prisons. So Conrad goes up the secret line September 17th, something like that, 1864, goes to Washington. Now, if you're Conrad and you go to Washington, you're not going to sit on a bench in Lafayette Square and watch, Lincoln's movements, because, a couple of days later, the federal detectives are going to say, "What are you doing here?" No. You would stay at a friend's home who is a deep cover underground, a deep cover Confederate operator. You'd be staying at this house on Lafayette Square. And that home is owned by a guy named Taylor. Ogle Taylor. And Taylor lived next door to Secretary of State Seward. So when Lewis Powell tries to kill Seward, it is the Taylors who go to Seward's aid to help him. Taylor is one of the wealthiest men in America. He has properties everywhere. He's filthy rich. He has a piece of property called Petworth Plantation out by the Soldiers' Home. He has property along the Nanjemoy Creek, where Booth keeps a boat to cross the Potomac River. He has property everywhere. He has parties at his house for senators and representatives and members of the Supreme Court. Presidents go to his parties. General officers go to his parties. And it is there that he and other spies in the network in Washington collect information, and these Northerners have no idea that their pocket's being picked. So that's Benjamin Ogle Taylor, T-A-Y-L-O-E. So if you're Conrad, you're going to stay at Taylor's house and just sit up in the one of the bedrooms upstairs and wait for the president to come out. And you see when he's leaving and when he returns. He also keeps track of the president when he goes to the old soldiers' home, which is about 3 miles away. There it is, up 7th Street, Washington. As many of you know, Lincoln would retreat to this place to get away from the heat in Washington, especially in the summer months, but also to get away from the political chaos, the pressures of the office. And during this time, President Lincoln almost always traveled alone, or maybe with one other person as a security guard. On a particular night, President Lincoln rides to the soldiers' home by himself. He is going up what we would call a driveway, the path up to that soldiers' home. A shot rings out, coming from Petworth Plantation. President Lincoln's horse rears up and his hat falls off, and he races up to the house. The next morning, a young lieutenant goes down that pathway and he finds the president's hat with a bullet hole in it. He goes to the president and says, "Mr. President, there's a bullet hole in your hat." Lincoln said, "Oh," he says, "probably somebody out shooting varmints last night." Well, who in the world at 12 o'clock at night or 11 o'clock at night is out shooting squirrels? Nobody. And he ordered the young lieutenant to keep it quiet. Don't say anything to anyone about that. That might have been Conrad, or it might have been somebody else. We don't know. But somebody took a shot at Lincoln from Petworth Plantation, owned by Benjamin Ogle Taylor, that night. Very interesting. At about the same time that Conrad went up the secret line to Washington, John Mosby had met with General Lee about the same time, somewhere around the middle of September of 1864. And Mosby forms Company F right after that, and sends a man named Watt Bowie, who was a Marylander, but he's also a spy, Lieutenant Watt Bowie, B-O-W-I-E, on a mission. And his mission is to capture Augustus Bradford, the governor of Maryland, at his hotel in Annapolis. The odd thing about this is that Mosby sends Bowie and 25 men south past Fredericksburg over to the northern neck of Virginia to cross the Potomac River and proceed up through Maryland around Washington to Annapolis. Why would anybody in their right mind do that? Why not just cross over the Potomac River in Loudoun County, in Montgomery County, and go from there? It just seems like a tremendous waste of time. Well, it turns out that Bowie and his men follow the precise, exact same path as Conrad did 10 days before. They leave on the 27th of September. Conrad left on the 17th of September. They follow the same exact path up the secret line. And unfortunately, Bowie is killed. He's mortally wounded. One of his men tries to steal has stolen a pair of boots from some Quakers, and the Quakers were not having any of that, and chased this group, and eventually waited for them the next morning, because they were coming around a bend, and one guy opened up on Bowie with a double-barrel shotgun and blew him out of his saddle, and he died. In some ways, that mission was a failure, but in other ways, it was not. It was a failure in that they didn't get Augustus Bradford. Now, I'm not so sure that that was the purpose of the mission anyway. I think that was a cover story. I think the true purpose of the mission was to see how well that secret line worked, and would it be possible to bring a captured Lincoln down the secret line, across the Potomac River and over to the Northern Neck onto Richmond. I think that was the purpose of the mission. So let's go on to late 1864. Here you have a photograph of General Phil Sheridan, Middle Military Division. By this time in 1864, there have been all kinds of murders and executions by both sides. 7 of Mosby's men were executed in September and October of 1864. The Blazer Scouts had been destroyed in November of 1864 by Mosby's men. Lots of things were going on. And by November of 1864, Phil Sheridan had had enough of Mosby. And so he decides to send 5,000 men into what was known as the Loudoun Valley, which is approximately 700 square miles of land in Loudoun County, Virginia, to destroy crops and to take or kill animals, horses, cattle, pigs, chickens, not to kill anybody, but to burn their homes, steal their furniture and their jewelry and their silver and everything else, and turn the Loudoun Valley into a wasteland, and thus deny Mosby a safe haven to operate. Mosby has operated many raids out of the Loudoun Valley, in the Loudoun Valley and from the Loudoun Valley. Sure enough, these men take 4 days rations, and from late November into early December, like about the 3rd or 4th of December, they pillage. They live off the land. They drive cattle and horses, and they destroy barns and fences and silos, grain deposits, and just leave the place in ruins. And that was the purpose of the thing. They wanted to turn the people into refugees, and they succeeded. There was a stench of death for days that hung over the valley. There's an image of what was called the burning of the Loudoun Valley and some of the destruction that was going on. Mosby had been shot December 21st, 1864. It was a gut shot. He was shot in the abdomen. The bullet went in 2 inches to the left of his navel, went all the way around his back, and came out. It did not hit any of his organs. Otherwise, he'd be dead. He escaped. While he's on recovery, he visits General Lee somewhere around December 7th in Petersburg. On December 5th, 1865, Colonel Mosby sees the Secretary of War and asks him to consider creating a regiment out of his battalion, to make it 2 battalions with a major commanding each battalion. And the legislature approved that. Mosby becomes a full colonel effective December 7th, 1865. But he also meets with General Lee on December 7th, 1865, or 1864, I should say, December 7th, 1864, to talk about where they go from here. Where does Mosby go? So Lee suggests that Mosby sends 4 of his 7 companies to the Northern Neck of Virginia. Why, oh why, oh why would Mosby send 4 of 7 companies to the Northern Neck? There wasn't any major fighting going on down there. The real fighting was around Petersburg, Richmond, Gordonsville. Why not put his troops to good use? That wasn't the plan. So he sends Lieutenant Colonel William Chapman, this fellow here you see on the screen, with 4 companies. These are the least experienced companies. He sends them to the Northern Neck, and Chapman, Mosby style, billets his men in friendly homes, 2, 3, 4 men to a home. They do not meet regularly. They don't form up as a company. They don't mess as a company. They don't meet as a company or companies. They just stay low and hidden. Why would they do that? The only thing, and I think, you know, and the official reason for them going down there in the first place was to gather food and rations, and also to do some recruiting. Well, if you take a little deeper look at that, you'll see that Confederate commanders down on the Northern Neck wanted nobody to come in and recruit the few people who were left to join the military, and they resented anybody coming in to recruit new soldiers. As far as the rations were concerned, or the gathering of food was concerned, that was just baloney. I think the real purpose, the true purpose of that mission was to have 4 companies in place should a captured President Lincoln be brought down the secret line across the Potomac River over into the Northern Neck, so that the Rangers could become a blocking guard, if you will, a blocking unit that would stop federal troops from recapturing President Lincoln. But there they were, 4 companies on the Northern Neck, and Colonel Chapman assigned 1 company to each county. Now, I'm going to divert again here. I want to talk about this man, Lewis Thornton Powell, and how Lewis Powell became Lewis Payne. Lewis Powell had joined the Army. I'm going to not talk about his early life, which is interesting, but it doesn't really play out here. Lewis Powell had joined a Florida unit, which was at Gettysburg. Powell was wounded on the 2nd day, shot in the wrist. He was still ambulatory, was captured, and he ends up, I believe, in the 12th Corps Field Hospital, helping Confederate wounded with whatever, getting them water or whatever. So there was a woman from Baltimore, Maggie Branson. Maggie Branson shows up. She's 30, he's 18 or 19, probably 18. They fall in love and have a frothing affair. In September of 1863, Lewis Powell is reassigned to a place called West Hospital in Baltimore. Now, Maggie, as I mentioned, is from Baltimore. Her father, Joseph Branson, is a deep cover Confederate operator who runs a boarding house in Baltimore. And the people who go through his house are generally Confederate spies, blockade runners, couriers, that sort of thing. Very low key. So Powell is in West Hospital, WESTS, West Hospital in Baltimore, down near the docks. Maggie finds a Union soldier's uniform, sticks a $10 bill inside pants, takes it to the guards and say, "Can you help me get this uniform to this guy named Lewis Powell?" Sure. Powell changes out of his Confederate uniform into a Union soldier's uniform, walks out of prison a free man. He reconnects with Maggie and they have a good old time. But he eventually says he needs to get back in the war. And so he believes that his unit, the 2nd Florida, is somewhere around Richmond. So he decides to take off. He wants to get back in the war in a really bad way. He ends up going down into Virginia and finds himself in Warrenton. And for some reason, he turns north instead of south. 4 miles above north of Warrenton, he stumbles into a place owned by a guy named Payne. And his name was John Scott Payne. John Scott Payne welcomes him in. Powell stays for a couple of weeks, getting his strength back and kind of figuring out what he wants to do. Payne says, if you want to get back in the war, there's no better way to do that than to join Mosby's Rangers. So he finds a way to seek out Mosby. Mosby likes this young man, likes his fire and his dedication to the Southern cause, and enlists him in Company B of Mosby's Rangers. Now, Powell is one of these guys who will do anything to get at the Yankees, anything. And there are a number of great stories about him doing that. But in November 1864, Mosby's Rangers destroy Blazer Scouts. And Blazer Scouts were a unit of Union soldiers, Union cavalry, who were given the 100 best horses, the 100 best rifles, the 7-shot Spencer carbines, and the 100 best soldiers to use them. And they hunted Mosby's men Indian style, just like Mosby hunted other people Indian style. And Mosby had enough of that. He said, we're going to fix those guys. And he sent a couple of companies out, and they destroyed Blazer Scouts in November of 1864. Lewis Powell was one of 5 Rangers sent by Mosby to accompany the POWs, the prisoners, down to Richmond. He's down there for about 3 weeks. And we believe that he was in the company of the Confederate Secret Service, who regale him with stories about how valuable his service would be if he would only join them. That being a soldier is not enough, but they like his fire. And they introduce him to powerful and wealthy men who tell him that he will be remembered as a hero of the South, that his name will live forever as a hero, and he will have wealth and riches that beyond his imagination. Powell returns to Mosby's Rangers in December 1864, a changed man. He is now very focused. He knows what he wants to do. He tells some of his buddies that he's going to be doing something that will change history. Doesn't tell them what it was, but he says it's going to change history. He eventually, and this is in January of 1865, Lewis Powell says goodbye to a few of his buddies in Mosby's Rangers. Says he's leaving. He dresses in civilian clothes. He goes to Fairfax, Virginia, seeks out an officer who will give him, or at least give him some information about getting an oath of allegiance to the United States. He's sent down to Alexandria, where he takes the oath, sells his horse, and takes a train to Baltimore to see, you got it, Maggie. It is within a few days, 7, 8, 9 days, that Lewis Powell is taken to David Preston Parr's shop. This is David Preston Parr. David Preston Parr is also a deep cover Confederate operator who owns Parr's China Shop, a high-end China shop as a cover. And he's been doing this for years. And David Parr has people who are couriers and people with medicine and information and orders and whatever, gold, whatever, pass through his shop, going either north into Canada or south to Richmond through the secret line or whatever. So David Preston Parr picks up Lewis Powell as an employee and sends him on some little missions to deliver medicine or, just little things. A few days after that, not many, 3 or 4, John Sarat Jr. visits David Preston Parr. Parr introduces Lewis Powell to John Sarat Jr. Within a couple of days of that, John Sarat Jr. introduces Lewis Powell to John Wilkes Booth. And that is the trail as to how Lewis Powell became part of John Wilkes Booth cabal, if you will, conspiracy group. I should also mention that Lewis Powell has changed his name to Lewis Payne. When Lewis Powell joined Mosby's Rangers, you may know that Mosby billeted his men in friendly homes in a very specific, defined area. The home that Lewis Powell was sent to was the home of Dr. Alban Payne, cousin of John Scott Payne. So Lewis Powell did not live with Dr. Payne, but he lived in a small house on the Payne property. The house is still there today in Paris, Virginia. And so when Lewis Powell gets his parole, or his oath of allegiance, he changes his name to Lewis Payne, P-A-Y-N-E or P-A-I-N-E, so that if he is ever captured, he knows all about the Payne family, who they were, how many there were, how old they were, what they looked like, and on and on and on. So he knew the Payne family. That's where Lewis Payne comes from. So now Lewis Powell is Lewis Payne and will remain so till the end of his life. You know, as you know, by this time in 1864, the Confederacy is really losing its grip. There are defeats on the battlefield. There are mass defections and desertions, I should say. The food stocks are declining. The supply system is crumbling, and the entire Southern operation is getting desperate. There is, and that's a picture of John Sarat Jr. I should have put that in a little earlier. And there's Booth. The Confederate Torpedo Bureau has perfected a timer, they think. And so it's called a horological bomb. Two men from the Torpedo Bureau go to Grant's supply depot at City Point, Virginia in August 1864, August 9th, 1864 to be precise. One of the men is carrying a box marked candles, but inside the box is 12 to 15 pounds of black gunpowder and a timer. He approaches a guard, a German, who is guarding a munitions boat on the James River. Now, this guy speaks to him in Gaelic, so the German has no idea what the guy's saying. He's basically motioning, gesturing, that he wants to put this box marked candles on the boat for the captain. And the German says, fine, go ahead. Well, the guy goes on there and sets the timer for an hour, and he and his buddy take off, go up on a hill, and from a bluff, they see this thing go off half a mile away. And when it goes up, one of the guys loses his hearing for the rest of his life. And here's a print of what that looked like. When that barge went off, it was a munitions barge. So there were just, bullets and artillery shells and, gunpowder and all this stuff on this munitions boat. And this thing went up, took out 180 feet of wharf, killed over 60 people. Ulysses Grant and his senior team were there, not far away. They were at City Point. Because it was August and it was extremely hot that morning, they had been meeting in the tent, but they put the flaps up. Grant, at that particular moment, was outside by himself, pondering great thoughts. And when this thing went up, he heard it and turned around, and suddenly, pieces of wood and missiles and all this junk comes flying down around him. And he thinks to himself, what in the world just happened? The Federals never really understood what happened. They believed it was more likely that some idiot with a cigarette just got a little too close to the gunpowder and set the thing off. They never thought that it might be a bomb. So now the Confederates know that they have a trigger that works. What are they going to do with that? You remember I said that things in 1864, at this time in 1864, were getting pretty desperate for the Confederacy. Colonel Mosby meets with General Lee in Petersburg for the last time, during the war anyway. And this is in late March of 1865. Lee has ordered that his 4 companies of Rangers be withdrawn from the Northern Neck. And mind you, this was on the 27th of March. Let me go back for just a moment, and it was on the 17th of March that Lewis Powell and John Wilkes Booth and Sarat and Harold thought they were going to get President Lincoln, who was going to attend a play at a federal hospital. And they had put weapons and leg irons and all this stuff into a buggy. They were going to just jump on President Lincoln after this event and take off heading south down through the secret line and capture him. That failed because Lincoln decided not to do that, but instead go to a hotel, the National Hotel in Washington, and go to a ceremony where they were praising the capture of a Confederate battle flag. So the whole operation to capture President Lincoln failed on the 17th of March, 1865. And that was the last opportunity anybody had to capture Lincoln. So now they're really desperate. General Lee orders because Mosby's men were in place to provide space for capturing President Lincoln, because they were also in place to protect John Wilkes Booth and his action team. They were no longer needed because that operation had failed. And so now General Lee is pulling those men out. It is now April 1st, 1865. April 1st, 1865, the capital of the Confederacy at Richmond is falling. People are running out of the city to get the heck out of there because it was going to go. The Confederate government is falling. They being the government, sends a team of saboteurs to Gordonsville, where they are met by the provost marshal there. And they are provided horses, fresh horses. You don't find fresh horses in April of 1865, but these guys were given fresh horses. Pardon me. And they ride 75 miles, 75 miles to Mosby's headquarters, then at Upperville, arriving the night of April 3rd or the morning of April 4th. On April 5th, 1865, Mosby forms his fifth and last company, Company H. And the team of saboteurs is embedded in that company. They are sent to Fairfax County with the official order was to blow up bridges and steal mules. This I find fantastic, because how in the world, what sense does it make to send 125 men into Fairfax County, Virginia in April 1865 to blow up bridges and steal mules? I think that's a cover story. Their mission was to blow up the White House with President Lincoln and his cabinet in it. The question all along is, how do you get inside the White House? How do you do that? Well, the first and second floors of the White House were secure, but not the basement. I found 3 men, one of whom had a wife, so there were 4 people who were discharged from the White House for various things that they did to upset the president. All 3 of them, or 4 in this case, would have had a reason to be revengeful against Lincoln and the Lincoln government. And at least 2 of the 3 had contacts or leanings with the Confederate government, and could have easily been turned by Confederate underground to find a way to help someone get into the basement of the White House to plant a bomb. My theory is that someone dressed as a delivery man could have taken, for example, milk cans with 25 pounds or 30 pounds of gunpowder in each one, maybe 50, who knows, and taken those cans into the White House, into the basement of the White House. And as you can see here in this diagram, the walls went from the up on the second floor all the way through to the basement. So if you know that the president is going to be meeting with the cabinet in the cabinet room on the second floor, and you can see the library and the oval there, the cabinet room is to the left of that, and that's on the south portico. You see the semicircle there. Those are the pillars of the south portico. So if you know that President Lincoln is going to be meeting with his cabinet in the cabinet room on, let's say, April 14th at 11 o'clock in the morning, which was published in all the newspapers, that you want to put your bomb in a place where it's going to be right under that spot. So that was the plan. They were going to blow up the White House with Lincoln in it. And the thought was that the Rangers, Company H, was going to blow up bridges and steal mules, which I think is baloney. I think the real purpose of the Rangers was to create a diversion so that the saboteurs could be taken into Washington. There was a house not even 2 blocks from the White House called the Van Ness Mansion. And I think that's where they would have stayed for a day or 2 or 3 until they could get into the White House. So here it is, April 10th, 1865. Lee is surrendered April 9th. Either the Rangers don't know about it or they don't know much about it. They're in position in Fairfax County. They stay at a place called Arundel's Tavern in Fairfax. There was a party that night. Some of the men found out about it and were invited to come. All the Rangers are invited. So Captain Baylor, who was the commanding officer, and several of his men go to this party. What's unusual about it is that many of the women were rude to the Rangers. That never happened. Most every time, women just loved being around the Rangers because they were bold and charismatic and fearless and all this. And this time, these women were rude, and Captain Baylor figured there was something not right about this, so he pulls his men out, and they go back to Arundel's Tavern for the night. The next morning, they get up and go out for this. This is April 11th. This is the day that President Lincoln's supposed to meet with the cabinet. They are met by 250 troopers from the 8th Illinois Cavalry, and in a running gunfight from Fairfax County way down into Wolf Run Shoals down near the Occoquan River, which is several miles, that unit was destroyed. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the saboteur, man named Frank Harney, Sergeant Frank Harney, and his team go the opposite direction, and they are captured up near the Potomac River. Harney has detonators and fuses, but no trigger. He's asked by his interrogators, "What are you doing with these?" And he says, "Well," he said, "we're supposed to blow up bridges and steal mules. This is what you use." Frank Harney is quite sophisticated. It's probably Frank Harney was probably the person who armed the CSS Hunley down in Savannah earlier that year. Or I'm sorry, when the Hunley sank the Housatonic. So here he is. Frank Harney is captured. His name is listed as Harvey when he is put into the Old Capitol Prison. He is eventually sent to a prison up in New York State, where he is let go. Oddly enough, on July 7th, the day the 4 conspirators were executed, he walks out of the prison in New York, a free man. He is never heard from again. There's no records of any marriage documents, land, real estate documents, or death records, or nothing. Not a word about Frank Harney ever is published. There's no photograph of him either. So Frank Harney vanishes. So on April 11th, 1865, Washington is delirious with joy that Lee has surrendered and the war is almost over. There's a crowd that forms outside the White House on the south portico of the White House, begging the president to come out and say a few words. Eventually he does. And in the crowd were John Wilkes Booth, David Harold, and Lewis Payne. President Lincoln starts talking about how relieved he is that the war is almost over. The effusion of blood is nearly at an end. And he looks forward to the day when the white and the black will be equal in the eyes of the law, and the black man will have the vote. And Booth turns to Powell and says, "Shoot him." And Powell says, "Are you crazy?" "No." And he says, "That is the last time," he said, "that is the last time that man will ever make a speech." And I believe that is the moment. That's the moment when Booth decides to take Lincoln out himself. It's too late to capture him. Lee is surrendered. All kinds of stuff going on. It's not going the right way. So I think that was the moment that Booth decided to kill Lincoln. So he does. April 14th, he shoots President Lincoln. Lincoln dies on the morning of April 15th. Booth and Harold run south. Lewis Powell tries to kill Secretary Seward and fails. Harold, who is to kill Andrew Johnson, gets drunk and says, "I can't do it." And Powell loses his horse. I think it was Harold or Sarat, one of them takes his horse and flees. Lewis Powell is eventually captured by federal agents as they're arresting Mary Sarat. And so that's how that happens. So there is this wanted poster, and it's interesting to note that John Sarat Jr. is on that poster with Booth and Harold. Booth and Harold flee to Maryland and pass down the secret line, ultimately crossing the Rappahannock River. Now, I think it's interesting to note that 3 Rangers, Willie Jett, that's Harold, there's Willie Jett, Absalom Ruggles Bainbridge, and Mortimer Bainbridge Ruggles, 2 cousins, crossed the Rappahannock with Booth and Harold. Was that an accident? I don't think so. When these guys are detained by federal officials, they say that they are from the Northern Neck. They were just trying to get home. If you think about it, their home was north of the Rappahannock, not south. So they crossed the Rappahannock with Booth and Harold. There was also a 6th passenger on that boat crossing the Rappahannock. His name was Enoch Welford Mason, who was a courier from the 15th Virginia Cavalry. And what was Mason doing on that watercraft? I think that Mason was on there so that he could race ahead until the underground where Booth and Harold were. They were being watched the entire time, from the time they left Washington until they got to Garrett's farm. And then Bainbridge and Ruggles were cousins. Ruggles was the son of General Dan Ruggles, who was his adjutant. He asked his father if he could become a member of Mosby's Rangers, and he was allowed to do that. Now, Willie Jett was a lieutenant. Ruggles and Bainbridge, all 3 of them were from the Northern Neck, and they were apparently recruited by Mosby's Rangers to become members of the Rangers. And they joined more than likely, probably in sometime in February, March of 1865. So Jett and his buddies guide Booth and Harold to the Garrett farm down in Caroline County on the Northern Neck. Garrett invites them to stay the night, but they decline, saying they're just trying to get home. They just want to go. And so Jett in particular is interested in seeing his girlfriend, a woman, she's 16 years old, Izora Goldman, Gouldman, Izora Goldman, whose father owns the Star Hotel in Bowling Green. And there's the Star Hotel. These 3 Rangers, Jett, Bainbridge, and Ruggles, have guided Booth and Harold to the Garrett farm. That is no accident. The night before, and this would be April 25th, 1865, the night before Booth is mortally wounded in the barn, a ranger named W.D. Newbill and 2 men from Company G have dinner with Booth and Harold at Garrett's farm. That's no accident either. Now, federal investigators track Willie Jett down to the Star Hotel. They've stopped off at a place called The Trap, which is a whorehouse, and they found from these women that Jett was on his way to see his girlfriend in Bowling Green. So they show up around midnight and arrest Willie Jett, probably beat the snot out of him, and get him to take them to the Garrett's farm. So it's Willie Jett, a Mosby Ranger, who leads federal officials to Garrett's farm. It is here now where John Wilkes Booth is mortally wounded. His spine is severed by a bullet, And this is a sketch of what it may have looked like for him, whereas he has no strength in his arms, and he says the words "worthless, worthless" at the end of his life, or well, the day before he died. So circling back to John Mosby, yeah, I struggled for years trying to figure out, try to decide if Mosby had any role in the conspiracy to capture or even kill the President of the United States. I concluded that he did, in fact, play a role in the conspiracy. In fact, I think Mosby was up to his eyeballs in that conspiracy to capture Lincoln, not to kill him. I think the notion of killing the President of the United States was repulsive to Mosby. He was a soldier. He was a lawyer. He didn't want any part of any of that. You know, when it comes to the notion of blowing up the White House with the president in it, did Mosby know about that? And I think he didn't. He said until the end of his life that he had nothing to do with that. He had nothing to do with any attempt to kill the president, whether it was Booth or the blowing up the White House. Nobody knew about that, by the way. He had nothing to do with it. And I think what saved him was this notion of need to know. John Mosby did not need to know the purpose of the Harney mission. All he needed to know was, you're going to form a company and escort these men into Fairfax County, where they will be met by friends of ours. That's all you need to know. And by the way, have your captain start a diversion over here so our guys can help them get somewhere. So I think Mosby did not know anything about the Harney mission, other than there were some guys from Richmond. They needed some help in getting into Fairfax. Start a diversion, call it what you want, but you don't need to know the rest of the story. The amazing thing to me about all of this is that not one single word ended up in any memoir, any letter, any book, any newspaper account, magazine account, family lore, none of it. Not one word passed down. None of it. And what I had to do was to put, it's all circumstantial evidence. I'll say that. But it's based on things that we do know that happened. We have dates of meetings, dates of movements of troops, dates of factual things that happened. And that's how I stitched together my theory. But I think I'm onto something here. And I am pleased to have shared this story with you. I think it's a fascinating story. And my hope is that, let me go into this. My hope is that somebody's going to buy this book, or maybe both of them. These are my books. The Ever the Gray Ghost sells for $35. The Hell is Being a Republican in Virginia, which is about the post-war relationship between Mosby and Grant, sells for $25. I will sell both of them for $50. I'm giving you a few moments to write down my name and address. If you'd like to buy a book or books, you can send me an email at mosbyman@infionline.net, INFIONLINE, infionline.net. I will take care of paying for taxes and shipping and handling. Your cost is the cost of the books. So it's been an honor and a pleasure to be with you this evening. And I thank you for your time. I hope it's been worth your while. And if you have any questions, I'll do what I can to answer them. Thanks a lot.